This is Matthew Cratter from Trader University, and today I want to talk about Bitcoin and the three worst case scenarios that I could see for Bitcoin. If you're interested in Bitcoin, crypto, the stock market in general, especially momentum stocks, or you just want to see what I'm trading or investing, be sure to hit that subscribe button. So I should start by saying that the nice thing about Bitcoin is that it functions a little bit like a perpetual call option, a call option that doesn't have an expiration date. And this is because it has fixed downside risk. So the worst that can happen if you buy some Bitcoin, the price of Bitcoin can go to zero. And you should always size your positions so that you'd be okay if something like this happened. But the good thing about Bitcoin is that it also has unlimited upside potential. If it works in the way I think it's going to work, it could go up a lot. So if you buy one Bitcoin now, it's trading at about $11,000 per Bitcoin. The most that you can use, assuming you don't do something dumb and use leverage, the most that you can lose is that $11,000 that you invest. Now, the good news is you can also buy a fraction of a Bitcoin. So if $11,000 is too much for you, doesn't mean you should be buying some coin like XRP or some lesser altcoin. You can buy a fraction of a Bitcoin. Again, none of this is investment advice, but I'm heavily invested in Bitcoin myself. So the most you can lose is the amount that you put up. And if I'm right, Bitcoin's going to 100,000, 200,000, probably in the next 12 months, and then into the millions over the next few years. So I like the optionality of Bitcoin, unlimited upside, limited downside. But let's talk about what are some things that can make Bitcoin go to zero. I think it's fairly unlikely at this point, but I can think of three scenarios off the top of my head that could seriously damage Bitcoin. The first one is less severe than people seem to think. So I always get comments and emails saying that the US is going to ban Bitcoin, just like they did with gold in 1933. So starting in 1933, it was the private ownership of gold was illegal in the US. And the US government did this because they wanted to devalue the dollar, and they did not want anyone to be able to protect themselves. But that being said, there were a lot of people who did not give up their gold when it became illegal. It was more difficult to buy gold, but if you had it in your basement, it's not like the government went to every house and searched every house in the US. This would be somewhat unconstitutional. In fact, it would be extremely unconstitutional. But the thing about banning something is that it actually makes it more valuable and more scarce. So when the government, I believe, banned Bitcoin, banned gold and marijuana at about the same point in history in the early 30s. And when you ban something, it makes the price go up. So if Bitcoin were to be banned, there's a scenario where the price actually goes up rather than going down. Also, I should point out that Bitcoin's much easier to hide than either something like marijuana or gold. And it's also much easier to transport. So you can memorize your 12-word recovery seed, which is the backup for a hardware wallet or any kind of wallet, really. And you could get on an airplane or walk across a border, move to a more friendly jurisdiction. This is much more difficult to do with some gold coins, or certainly with much more difficult to do with gold bars. And so my scenario here would be the only way this would really hurt Bitcoin is if you had a simultaneous ban globally. And I think it's very unlikely that every country in the world would want to cooperate to simultaneously ban Bitcoin, especially because now a lot of wealthy people own Bitcoin. Wealthy people exert a lot of influence on world governments, for better or for worse. And also, I believe that many government officials already own some Bitcoin, particularly in places like China. So there's a lot of resentment against the US dollar. People who are inside the US don't always realize this, but there's obviously resentment against the US and the way it sort of stomps around the globe and prints its own money, and buys oil and buys weapons with it. So there are a lot of countries who would be very happy to see the US dollar fall, and Bitcoin is a very nice way of sort of a Trojan horse that could destroy the US dollar. So it's very unlikely that you could get a global ban. If you get a local ban, let's say it's banned in the EU, or it's banned in Canada, or it's banned in the US, Bitcoiners can just leave that country, and it's very easy to leave. As I said, because you can basically store your Bitcoin in your head. That being said, it looks like the US is now going the route of regulation. Kraken was just approved as the first crypto bank a couple days ago, and the Office of Currency Comptroller a couple months ago said all banks can now custody or store cryptocurrencies. So it looks like the US is going to regulate Bitcoin, and tax it. And it's taxed just at the normal long-term capital gains rates or short-term capital gains rates that stocks are. So it's basically beginning to function like any other capital asset. It just happens to be very scarce digital asset. So it looks like, at least for the time being, for the next couple of years, it's very, very unlikely that Bitcoin is banned in the U.S. And even if it is banned in the U.S., perhaps something somewhere like Samoa or Singapore or Australia, some country says, you know what, we love Bitcoiners, come and live here and spend your money in our economy. So I think the risk of a Bitcoin ban in the U.S. the risk has passed. There was a risk early on. The risk has passed. Now, when Bitcoin gets a few $1 trillion market cap, in other words, when it goes up 5x, 10x, 20x from here, then the U.S. may change its tune. But at that point, anyone who owns Bitcoin is going to be so wealthy that they're going to have options. So that's worst case scenario number one, some sort of Bitcoin ban. Worst case scenario number two, people are always talking about quantum computers and a quantum computer attack on Bitcoin. Now, supposedly Google already has some form of quantum computer. They may have the hardware, but not the software to run it. If any of you guys know more details about this, this is an area. I'm not a super technical guy, certainly when it comes to cryptography. But this is basically, as I understand it, that Bitcoin uses something called asymmetric cryptography. And also the U.S. financial system uses this as well. Banks use it. Parts of the internet use it. But basically what asymmetric cryptography means, obviously cryptography is just a branch of mathematics that deals with security and codes and encryption. But under this AC, you can use the private key to easily derive the public key. So if you own Bitcoin, there's a public address you can have it sent to. There's a private key that you need to use in order to move it. It's a little bit like a username and a password. The private key is like the password. The public key or public address is like the username or email address. That's sort of the analogy. But under asymmetric cryptography, you can use the private key to easily derive the public key and make sure that they're related. But you cannot, if you know someone's public key, like I could give you my public key or one of my public keys right now, and there'd be no risk. You could just send Bitcoin to me if you wanted to. But right now, using the current computers, non-quantum computers, you could not take my public key and use it to hack my private key. But there is an algorithm, there are probably a few of them. The one I know about is Peter Shor's 1994 quantum algorithm that can be used to break the security of asymmetric cryptography. So if you have a working quantum computer, you could take someone's public key, use it to derive their private key, and then you would do this to all the public addresses you could find because they're all over the internet. And then basically you would move all this Bitcoin using the private keys as quickly as you could. You'd send it to crypto exchanges like Gemini and Coinbase. You would dump the Bitcoin as fast as possible for US dollars or euros or something like that. And this would create a massive panic, obviously. The price of Bitcoin would go down tremendously, and it could possibly destroy, and it would probably destroy faith in the Bitcoin network, because if there's no security, if you're putting your money in a bank vault that doesn't have a key that works anymore, then there's really no point. Now there are a couple ways of preventing this from happening, as I understand. So for example, there used to be P2PK public addresses in Bitcoin, and then there was an update. So now for a few years, there have been P2PKH public addresses, and these are safe if they've never been used to spend Bitcoin, simply because these public addresses are not public. And if no one knows your public address, they can't use it to hack your private keys. So what you could do today is you could move your Bitcoin to a P2PKH public address and not tell anyone that address. And this would be one way of defending against a basic quantum attack. Now, if we start having quantum computer attacks, the whole system is in trouble. You could use quantum computers to hack into people's Wells Fargo bank accounts, I'm sure. You could use it to hack into military targets, etc. So this is a bigger problem. It's not just a problem for Bitcoin. But as I understand it, there's also a lot of talk about how Bitcoin, the network, and the hashing algorithm could be updated or upgraded, and you could actually use quantum computers to secure the Bitcoin network itself. So if you can use a computer or a technique to attack a network, theoretically you can use that same type of computer or technique to secure the network. Now, I think this is still some ways off. Even if there are quantum computers yet, writing the software for them, as I understand it, is very difficult. And so again, this is a problem that is a few years out. I would imagine at least 5 years, maybe 10 years or more. But it is a risk. You could have a private group that develops this and goes on a rampage and steals everyone's Bitcoin. So that is one possible risk at this point. I'll link to an interesting article from Deloitte about quantum computers and the Bitcoin blockchain. Now, finally, we're going to talk about this sort of the zombie apocalypse worst case scenario, which is a terrible, terrible scenario. And under this scenario, Bitcoin is the last thing that anyone, even Bitcoiners, are going to be worrying about. But this is basically how it works. It's what's called an EMP attack. You may have heard of these. EMP is just an electromagnetic pulse. It's obviously invisible, moves through the air, according to Maxwell's equations. But the way you would develop one of these or cause one of these, if you were really evil, is you explode a few nuclear bombs at a high altitude above a country or above a continent. You could do this above the U.S. You could do it above multiple countries. So you could do it above U.S., above Asia, above Europe, South America, Africa, etc. Now, the scary thing about this is you don't need to be especially advanced to do this. You just need to be able to build a nuclear bomb, or you need to be able to steal one, because you're not worried about hitting a city precisely. So it's very difficult to launch a nuclear weapon and make it hit a capital city, for example. But here, it's a little bit more like a dirty bomb. You just need to get it up in the air above a continent or above a large area at a high altitude. And so this is something conceivably any terrorist group or some hostile nations could do to another nation. Now, EMPs are not especially dangerous to human beings, but they do destroy electronic devices and systems. Now, if you've ever had something connected to a power grid, like a TV, and you didn't have a surge protector and there's a lightning strike, you know how this works. This will be very similar, but at a much higher scale, and it will be going through the air as well as going through the power grid, and surge protectors will not protect against something like this. The problem with an EMP attack, the biggest problem, is it will destroy all semiconductors. It will make them unusable. It will wipe them out. CPUs, SSDs, anything that uses semiconductors. And obviously now everything uses semiconductors. Your refrigerator, your microwave, obviously your cell phone, etc. So the big problems are these. The U.S. electricity grid will be completely disabled, possibly for years. It would take a very, very long time to rebuild everything, because you will need to restart the semiconductor factories. Airplanes will drop out of the sky because their navigation equipment will stop working. Everything that runs on a semiconductor. Cars will stop working. If you have a car that's been built after about 1980, your car will not start and you'll not be able to drive it because of how prevalent semiconductors are. So there'll be no electricity, no forms of transportation except maybe bicycle and walking, no electricity, and no electricity means no water pumps, no water filtration and treatment at water utilities. So you'll no longer have electricity or running water at your house. You won't have heat. You won't be able to keep your house cool or keep your house warm in the winter. Even if you have a well, you'll now need to pump your water by hand. You'll need to have some sort of hand pump. You'll need to figure out a way to purify it by hand as well if you're relying on electronic or electric purification treatment devices. Obviously, cell phones will stop working. They'll all be wiped out. Your refrigerator and freezer won't work because you won't have electricity. You won't be able to produce ice. It will also destroy solar panels because they have so many semiconductors in them. So you won't be able to get electricity or heat your house using solar either, unless you just have big windows and the sun can heat through your windows. As I said, no cell phone connection, no internet. And so if you were to do this, if you're extremely evil and you did this above every continent, you could basically disable the global internet, and you could disable it for years. Even if there were still communication devices in satellites, for example, there's the Blockstream satellite that has the Bitcoin blockchain. it would be very problematic figuring out a way to communicate with these satellites as well. And if you didn't have a cell phone or a working laptop, you probably wouldn't even be able to connect to satellite internet. And even if a few people could, it wouldn't do you much good if you didn't have electricity and if there were no other people to talk to. If Amazon was down, for example, it wouldn't do you any good. You wouldn't be able to order anything, obviously. And the delivery trucks wouldn't work either, so they couldn't even bring you stuff. How long would it take to restart, get the electric grid back up, get semiconductors working? Most of them are now in China. How do you get the semiconductors to Europe or to the United States? Obviously, all Bitcoin equipment, all the ASIC miners would be destroyed by EMP if this were to happen over China, for example. Now, you can protect your hardware wallet. You could protect your cell phone or your laptop with a Faraday cage. You can look up what that is, but it basically is a way of shielding from electromagnetic radiation. But even so, you would need a lot of people to have done this. And even if you have a working laptop or working hardware wallet, if you can't connect to the internet and if there's no one to talk to, it doesn't do you any good. Now, you'll still have your 12-word recovery seed, which is good. And so if things ever get back up, you'll be able to just buy a new hardware wallet and restore your Bitcoin funds. But the real problem is, how do you get to that point? Because if something like this were to happen, what you're going to need much more than Bitcoin or even gold is you're going to need some form of self-defense, guns, ammo. You're going to need a garden or way of producing food. Grocery stores will get emptied very quickly. There won't be a way to transport food from farms to get them to the grocery store. You'll need a source of water, and if you have a well, you'll need a hand pump, as we said, and you'll also need a remote location. I'm sorry if this is becoming sort of zombie apocalypse, but it's as we know, after 2020, really weird things could happen and terrible things can happen. So I think it makes some sense to at least be aware of this scenario. So if you had a major EMP attack of the type we're talking about, you could see all the cities descending into chaos. There won't be food. There'll be a lot of rioting because the police won't be able to control everyone. There'll be disease from a lack of fresh water. If you live in a city, where's your source of water? It's really your sink and drinking fountains and these sort of things. Nothing. All the pumps will stop working. The toilets will stop working. There's a very good chance that all the toilets will back up and send raw sewage into everyone's homes and apartments. And you'll have really a complete breakdown of civilization. And once all the food is exhausted in the cities, people will leave the cities and spread out and just start breaking into people's homes in the suburbs and eventually in rural areas, looking for food, looking for ammunition and guns, looking for anything they can find. So this would be just absolutely terrible. It would be like sort of a real life zombie apocalypse movie. Now, if this were just to happen to one large location like the US, you could see a scenario where Bitcoin is fine in Asia and Europe. The Bitcoin miners keep working. The full nodes keep verifying the blockchain and the transactions. And so this would not completely wipe out Bitcoin. But for all intents and purposes, if you're an American with Bitcoin and even if you're on one of the coasts, that you won't be able to get on a boat. It'll be like the Titanic. The boats won't even be working. What are you going to do? Get in a rowboat and row to China so you can redeem your Bitcoin? Possibly. But you're pretty much in big trouble unless you can sort of wait it out in a safe location. As I said, there's the Blockstream satellite in space, which contains the latest version of the Bitcoin blockchain. So theoretically, people could communicate with this satellite. There may be other satellites as well, and so they could sort of keep the Bitcoin network working, assuming that this didn't happen simultaneously over every continent. As I said, in this case, a few gold or silver coins are probably a really good thing to have, so you can buy certain things. But I think under a scenario like this, gold and silver, there really won't be food to buy. And there won't be water or guns to buy because they'll be more valuable than even a precious metal. That being said, it's pretty cheap insurance to have a few gold or silver coins. Now, EMPs could also be caused, there are other ways they can occur, not just by nuclear attack. They could be caused by if a meteor hits a spacecraft, for example, if a meteor hits the International Space Station, or if a meteor hits the Earth or as it hits the atmosphere, I don't understand exactly how this works, it could create a very big EMP pulse that could have a similar effect. And if it happened over a major country or major continent, it could cause big problems. Obviously, there's also the solar flare, the solar EMP, what they call a CME, the coronal mass ejection, where you get this blast of energy, electromagnetic energy coming from the sun that could have a very similar effect. And you can go online. It's a very deep rabbit hole on YouTube. It seems like this is more likely than most people realize, but it's one of those things that you don't really want to stay awake at night thinking about, because there's nothing you can do about it. So I would say that this third worst case scenario for Bitcoin, it really is a big problem for Bitcoin. Bitcoin relies on the internet. If there's no global internet, or if there's no internet over a large area, it doesn't really help you. You could see a scenario where you get very kind of local versions of the blockchain that function. People have suggested that people would do the blockchain on paper and update transactions that way. I just don't think that's reasonable. I don't think that would happen. And so an EMP pulse or an EMP attack would be a major problem for Bitcoin, for the internet, and for human civilization as a whole. If you found this video helpful and you'd like to be notified when I make more videos, be sure to hit that subscribe and like button. Hopefully this didn't depress everyone too much. Let me know in your questions and comments in the comment section below. And if you have other interesting scenarios about Bitcoin or these sort of attacks that you'd like to share, I'd definitely be interested in hearing from you in the comments. Thanks a lot for listening, and I'll see you in the next video.